We now have a sense of how different classes are defined. Next, let's take a look at the growing inequality I hinted at already. Turn to Figure 8.7 in your handout. The first thing you should notice is that this chart focuses on the upper class. Again, that's the top 10% in the US. The vertical axis indicates that we're now focusing on the percentage of total wealth owned by the upper class. The bottom line shows the percent of national income they earn just from their jobs. The top line, with the black triangles, shows the percent of the national income they earn when you look at the total income of the upper class. So what they earn from their job plus what they get from things like investments. When you look at the numbers over time, you can see that income inequality was at its lowest in the United States between 1950 and 1980. Since that time, income inequality has exploded because the upper class is taking a larger and larger portion of the total income. Almost half of all income earned in the entire country in 2010 went to the upper class. Part of this is due to the increase in the value of the stock market and the income earned from investments. But another major part of this growing inequality comes from the salaries earned by those in the upper class. We'll go back to these points in upcoming video segments. In the meantime, you can see that the upper class has experienced tremendous gains over the past 30 years in terms of the proportion of the nation's total wealth they have. However, the bulk of these gains actually go to the dominant class. Remember, that's the top 1% of the population. If you turn to Figure 8.8, you'll see what the data says about the dominant class. You see the same overall pattern where the share of income going to the dominant class was lower between 1950 and 1980, and then it goes up. By 2010, the top 1% of the population was bringing in 20% of the total national income. Remember, the top 10% raked in about 47% of the total income. The top percent of that group, the dominant class, claimed 20% all by itself, leaving 27% of the total income for the well-to-do class and 53% for the middle and lower classes combined. Of course, remember that the lower class, the bottom 50% of the population, only saw about 5% of the total national income. Just for comparison, let's look at what the dominant class, the top 1%, earned in France during this same time period. Watch the image on the screen shift as the slide changes. It's all on the same scale. There's clearly a remarkable difference here. And remember that France is still considered to have a moderately high level of income inequality when compared with Scandinavian countries. Even so, in France in 2010, the dominant class, the top 1%, also enjoyed about 9% of the national income. If you turn to Figure 8.1, you'll see the share of the national income that went to the top 10%, the upper class in France. Again, it's much lower than in the US. In France, the upper class took in about 33% of the total national income in 2010, compared to 47% going to the upper class in the United States. Let's go back to the chart, focusing on the upper class in the United States. So go back to Figure 8.7. Remember that the shocks of the 1900s and the economic and social policies implemented in their aftermath restructured the economy in such a way as to allow for the emergence of the propertied middle class, an historically unprecedented development. The world had never seen such a class before. The major dip in the share of income going to the upper middle class we see here in this chart shows the impact of this restructuring. The share of the total income going to the upper class dropped. Where did it go? It went to the newly created propertied middle class, not the lower class. Remember, their share of the national income stayed basically the same at 5% of the total throughout this entire time period. In other words, between 1950 and 1980, the top 50% of the population had its income and wealth redistributed in a way that benefited and ultimately expanded the middle class. The bottom 50% of the population, the lower class, saw no improvement in their share of the total income in the US during that same time period. But as you can see, this started changing again in the 1980s. The upper class began to take a larger portion of the total income again, so that they're doing even better now than they were before World War I. We seem to be returning to what historians call the Gilded Age of the United States, a time of robber barons and extreme wealth at the very top of society, especially the top 1%. Remember that we started this whole topic on the concentration of wealth by noting that there are mechanisms for both economic convergence and divergence, for the reduction and the growth of economic inequality. These charts show us the impact of these mechanisms operating in both directions. We see the evidence of convergence and of divergence. But what exactly are these mechanisms? What causes economic convergence, greater equality? And what causes economic divergence, increasing inequality? We'll cover that in the next video.